You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
Hello, listener. Just a quick note from us to say that this episode was first recorded on Monday, the 8th of July. Okay, back to the podcast.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hi, I'm Jason Ilagan, Executive Producer of the IOE podcast and Senior Digital Communications Manager here at IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. We're recording this a few days after UK voters decided to hand the centre-left Labour Party a parliamentary majority, and at the same time, Europe is broadly in the grip of what some call a right-wing populist surge. Last month's European election saw a historic number of representatives of far-right parties elected to the European Parliament. And in France, snap elections were called by President Emmanuel Macron, and thousands took to the streets to protest against a potential far-right victory. So today, we're taking a closer look at the power of political protest, the response to the rise of populism, and the research evidence behind it with our guest, Dr. Ben Abrams. Ben is lecturer in sociology and Leverhulme Fellow in the IOE's Department of Education, Practice and Society. Alongside the study of mobilization, Ben also examines revolutions, resistance, and contentious politics. In his book, The Rise of the Masses, Ben looks at how some of history's most momentous mass risings took place and uses them to build a theory of spontaneous protest. Ben, I'm looking forward to discussing your fascinating work with you today, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to be with you here.
All right, Ben, a bit of an icebreaker. Could you please tell us a bit about your academic journey and how did you become interested in your area of research?
So quite some time ago now, when I was actually a undergraduate student, I became interested in the genesis of revolutions and how and why they happened, mostly because I was trying to answer this question as to whether you could have a revolutionary system and a democratic system hand in hand. Could there be such a thing as a revolution that was carried out not by force, but by democracy? And in answering this question, I began to probe deeper questions about how perhaps revolutions might occur, how they might take place. And this led me into this kind of sociological journey about all of the different dynamics of mobilization and participation and social movements and all these intricate parts that I hadn't really thought about when I initially approached the question. Over time, then that took me to the United States to study people working in the Occupy movement and the aftermath of that mobilization, to Egypt to look at revolutionary mobilization there, and then into the archives of protests past. And that has brought me to what I do today.
I'm just curious about, you've cited some recent examples like the Occupy Wall Street movement and things like that. How far back in history have you kind of gone?
So the oldest case that I've done concerted work on is the French Revolution of 1789. That is, in many ways, the democratic revolution par excellence. It's a revolution where they kind of built democracy haphazardly and often quite violently, but they eventually built what seemed to be the world's first sustained mainstream democracy as we understand it. And the laws of that democracy still endure in France in the present day. That legacy is still there in how European democracy is conceived. That said, I also work on very recent stuff as well. So some of my recent work, for example, concerns the Black Lives Uprising in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police. So what I like to do is I like to bridge these historic cases with quite different societies and contexts with novel, more recent cases to see if there are lessons that we can learn from the present that tell us about the past and the past that tell us about the present, all with the goal of building a kind of more general, applicable theory that can deal with diverse cases and contexts.
Oh, great. Could you explain in a little more detail about your sort of approach to research into sort of these large collective struggles?
Yeah, so I do what I sometimes call comparative history plus. That's to say, rather than being a conventional historian who looks only to the archives or to secondary sources, other historical works, I also look to the more ethnographic and interview-based side of research. So sometimes I'll spend time with activists or organizers or people participating in forms of resistance. I'll be talking to them about what that struggle constitutes. I'll be observing how these practices actually take form in reality, as well as looking at kind of long-form qualitative interviews that I might conduct with people involved in these struggles, not just on the side of the protagonists, but also with antagonists, with people who are perhaps bystanders, but nonetheless influential. I try to triangulate all of these different sources and bring them together.
So yeah, lots of sort of stuff on working on the ground, meeting people from across the spectrum. That's really fascinating. So can we talk about your book? So you've written recently in The Rise of the Masses about a model that allows lawmakers to look at society and understand the triggers for people to participate in protests. Ben, could you tell us a little bit more about this model?
Absolutely. First, of course, I preface this with the model is really intended for anyone looking to achieve a sustainable, positive social change in a society, and to do that while leveraging the power of ordinary people and engaging with them in order to achieve that. And so I don't just see this as something that can be imposed from the top down. Rather, I see it as a tool for people organizing from the bottom up. And so it's not just from a policy perspective, top-down model. Rather, we're looking at how groups of people who are organizing to change society for the better can help achieve that social change by recognizing how ordinary people might participate in protests. But with that said, I would probably describe the model as hinging on two key components. The first is something I call affinity. These are the kind of predispositions that ordinary people have to participate in a particular cause. Sometimes this can arise from social factors that impact on someone's life, such as their resources, obligations, patterns of activity, or social status. At other times, it can be more psychological factors, such as their identity, their attitudes, perceptions of injustice, their interests, or their socio-emotional needs, the things that kind of drive them in their everyday. These affinities all work together to help bring people and causes together. The second component I look at are the social conditions that catalyze people's participation in what we sometimes call contentious politics, those instances of protest or revolt or resistance that we see every day. These conditions I term conditions of convergence. These can make participation in politics more advantageous, more possible, or more important for ordinary people. Sometimes they can occur at a structural level, constituting certain situations that might help encourage participation, or at the level of popular belief, encompassing the kind of widespread frames that we see in the media, social media, and society that help us feel that participation is or is not a certain kind of thing, a certain kind of way. It might feel easier, it might feel harder, it might feel that the moment is especially unique, for example. And then finally, I also examine certain spaces where the physical conditions are especially conducive to participation. And these conditions that I term conditions of convergence work together with those affinities to catalyze mass participation in protests.
Ben, could we perhaps break down how the affinity and the convergence sort of theory is applied? Could we perhaps look at the example of the events that followed the killing of George Floyd?
Yeah, that's a really interesting example, actually, because it brings together so many different elements of affinity and convergence and talks about how they work together. So for context, the overall theory is called affinity convergence theory because of the kind of corporation of these two elements. In broad brush, affinity is the predisposing factor, convergence is the catalyst, and then they work together and they affect mass mobilization. So let's break that down in the context of the Black Lives Uprising after the killing of George Floyd. One of the really interesting elements here is that although there is a heightened sense of threat that initially helps mobilize people after George Floyd is killed, things really take a turn, actually, with the rise of what I call an opportune situation following a victory against police forces on the streets of Minneapolis. A few days into the protests, the police get pushed off the street. And all Minneapolitans who are really quite afraid of their police forces, right? These are armed guys with guns. They've just killed one of their own citizens. And this fear suddenly drops when the police are successfully pushed back off the street. And eventually, it drops altogether when the police station itself is burned down by protesters. This moment then catalyzes copycat protests across the United States, with ordinary people sensing this idea that you can, in fact, defeat the police on your own streets, something that people didn't really consider possible in American protests. And so this opportune situation is what then creates the groundswell for much more mobilization. At the same time, we have to look at what predisposes people to join these mass protests after the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct gets burned down. One of the key things here is that unlike in many other situations, there were large swathes of the population who had certain social statuses that meant they were especially available for mobilization. So if you remember, this was during the depths of COVID. A lot of people didn't have their day job. A lot of people who were in full-time education had their studies cancelled. There was this abundance of free time among certain segments of the population. And so when this kind of opportune situation arises, they are already predisposed to be able to seize it. They already have a kind of conducive social status, the right patterns of activity to allow them to go in and protest. By contrast, by the way, it was also the case that certain people who didn't have predispositions that were suitable for protest, or in fact had predispositions against protest. People who had SHIELD, for example, during the pandemic, people who maintained their in-person work obligations. You didn't see those people showing up. And so this was kind of this interesting illustration of how these predispositions, these affinities, were shaping who turned up when this opportune moment arose. More broadly, however, the COVID-19 pandemic was this kind of, again, we would call it in terms of the model, an exceptional situation, a period of time where the norms and rules of society were a little different. And so people were able to engage in protest in ways they wouldn't necessarily be able to at other times. As the protests went on, however, interesting other kind of catalysts emerged. One fun example is that there was a small restaurant essentially set up during one of the protest waves in Portland, something called Riot Ribs. It was this kind of moving restaurant where people would go and get these absolutely delicious cooked ribs. And people would show up just to try the ribs and get drawn into participation in protest. It created these kind of exceptional physical spaces where a nearby student or someone walking by would say, "Oh, I've heard these ribs are really good," and then suddenly walk into swathes of tear gas descending upon them from police officers and find themselves radicalized into participation in protest by virtue of the fact they were under police assault.
Yeah, like I don't want to sound flippant about it, but that there's that saying about the way to someone's heart is through their stomach. So it sounded like it was a way to sort of win hearts and minds to the sort of the broader cause.
Absolutely. I can't speak to the context of, well, actually I probably can. I was going to say I can't speak to the context of the French Revolution, but really actually all four of the cases I look at in The Rise of the Masses, the French Revolution of 1789, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, and the Black Lives Uprising of 2020, all of them have essentially some form of restaurant or cafe or open kitchen that emerges and sustains these protests and brings people in to participation. In the case of Egypt, it was these enormous batches of lentil soup being cooked up in people's flats, as well as a kind of disused KFC restaurant that gets turned into a mobile clinic. In the Black Lives Uprising, it was things like Riot Ribs, this kind of ribs restaurant that was kind of moving around and roving with the protests. In the case of Occupy, there was this massive central kitchen that people came to donate food to and came for meals as well. And then in the French Revolution, it was the cafes, coffee houses, and all sorts of other places that people were gathering to participate in political discourse and subsequently protest.
Yeah, you've just reminded me, because I was in New York around the time of the Occupy Wall Street movement in, was it 2011? And, I was there on holiday, but yeah, I do remember passing by and sort of seeing the kind of, village that they've had set up. And I do recall, community spaces, communal spaces for people to eat and drink and socialize and talk. So this is all really fascinating. I wonder if we could kind of move back to sort of a policy sort of approach. Would you be able to sort of describe how your work might be useful in terms of informing policy for, positive social change?
Absolutely. I think one of the key things that we see in mass protests is that ordinary people can be driven to the street for both ordinary and extraordinary reasons. And it's often those ordinary reasons and extraordinary reasons working in parallel. And what we often see in mass protests, particularly those associated with the far right, but not exclusively, is that there are instances where there are mass outbreaks of violence. One of the key lessons that you can take away from the work that I've done in The Rise of the Masses, as well as my broader work, is that there are really key ways in which policymakers and governments can set rules for their police departments, set rules for their other public bodies that help prevent the outbreak of violence at protests. One of the key ones that I stressed to policymakers in Colombia some time ago was that you must, if you are policing a protest, never escalate violence on behalf of your kind of government or regime or policymaker. The moment at which you create a violent protest, the moment at which police start using violence against peaceful protesters, it changes who can come out. Suddenly you select for people who are prepared to be violent. You select for people who are willing to fight your police officers. And so you create, by using police repression, by using violent repression, you create violent protests. You construct an environment in which the only people who will be able to participate are those who are psychologically or socially ready for a violent confrontation. And so one of the really key things I always stress when I'm talking to policymakers is when you say, oh, send in the cops, disperse this protest, you're not doing what you think you're doing. What you're doing is you're setting a norm around force that means that the people who are going to be coming out will be ready for a violent conflict. The peaceful people who were there before, they disappear. And so the norm among the group completely changes. Suddenly you have a situation in which everyone is ready to fight the police. And those who might say, oh, guys, let's calm down, let's not get into a confrontation, they're gone because you've shot them with tear gas, you've beat them up, you've brutalized them. And so that was one key thing that I emphasized in the Colombian context. And so that's certainly something I'd like policymakers to take away. More broadly, if you're looking to encourage people to participate in forms of peaceful demonstration around positive outcomes for social change, if you want to encourage a healthy civil society, one of the key things policymakers can do is look at the barriers to protest, the barriers to participation, and start taking them away. Think about how you're constraining people's patterns of activity, for example, and ask, am I creating a society in which people feel able to go and peacefully demonstrate for something they believe in? Or am I creating a society in which people might not feel able to do that? Maybe because they're overworked, maybe because they're afraid, maybe because their lives are so fragmented from kind of urban centers or cores that they can't come together collectively and make their demands peacefully. Because those conditions can also be very, very dangerous. You might think, of course, that policymakers would want to discourage protest in their societies. But as we've seen in recent years, when you discourage the peaceful expression of people's opinions and views in civil or civic protest, what you get instead is often a much more forceful rebuke, either at the ballot box or in sporadic outbreaks of very unruly activity that don't obey the norms and rules that we associate with society, but which instead may often be resentful or violent or fuel the populist upsurge that we've seen recently and encourage a form of society that is maybe less positive about the rights of citizens.
Yeah, right. Ben, you mentioned the example of your work in Colombia. So as I understand it, you've worked with a certain organization in Colombia to sort of help prevent, violence in mass protests. Could you tell us more about this collaboration and how you've interacted with politicians and human rights activists to communicate your findings?
Yeah, absolutely. This was actually something that was a real rare pleasure and something that I didn't quite realize till I was doing it, quite the impact it would have. I was invited to give a presentation for the Program for Peace in Colombia following the change of government there. And they were interested specifically in how they can make protests more civil and cordial and support a vibrant civil society, as well as reducing the outbreak of political violence. There I talked to an array of people who were from civil society organizations, from a policy framework, from politics, and I think as well from the kind of law enforcement apparatus about how we would make society essentially more conducive to peaceful protest and help reduce outbreaks of political violence. And that collaboration is one that's kind of humming along at the moment in a quite nice way, and I'm looking for more opportunities to leverage it. But it was really a brilliant chance to talk to such an array of people who were genuinely interested in creating, on the one hand, a supportive environment for protest, and on the other hand, trying to avoid these outbreaks of violence that so often can cause societies to unravel and sometimes civil wars even to break out.
Yeah, thank you for that. Of course, our chat wouldn't be complete without looking at the surge of populism in the UK and abroad and what insights your research has provided. Would you be able to tell us more about how you've been working advising Cambridge policy fellows on coping strategies against populism?
Yeah, so this has been an interesting thread of my research. One of the things I've been particularly interested in is the way in which societies respond to the rise of populist or so-called populist administrations that often seek to take power from the people and concentrate it in its own hands, claiming to represent them somehow uniquely. And One of the things that I've emphasized in the discussions I've had through the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy is really emphasizing that in order to effectively respond to populism, you have to not only form kind of civil society cores that can maintain the norms that we associate with conventional democratic societies, with what is sometimes called liberal democracies, but also we have to be prepared to empower people actively to allow citizens to practice politics in a way that goes beyond the ballot box. And that can be really challenging, I think, often even for liberals who want to say, okay, right, we should be ruling in this kind of technocratic manner. We should be giving people rights, but we should be instead still in charge of the show. Paradoxically, it's only by relinquishing that power a little bit, giving back to the people, that you create a kind of civil society that then won't hand all of its power to a populist who says, let me rule in your stead. The only way for you to have power is to give it to me. Instead, we have to create this kind of substantive democracy in our societies that allows people to have impact in their everyday lives on the way in which their societies are governed, rather than only in these kind of electoral intervals.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to sort of briefly jump back to your work around an affinity convergence theory. I'm curious, do you think this can be applied to other forms of action, such as voting?
So that's a great question. This is actually something that we're playing with at the moment. Affinity convergence theory is conceived of as a theory of spontaneous participation in politics, basically, contentious politics specifically. And so one of the things I became quite interested in recently is whether we might see spontaneous forms of participation in elections, particularly from constituencies of people who maybe don't usually vote, or who maybe if they do vote a very different way, whether there might be an element of spontaneity in elections, or whether even if there were not spontaneity, there might be some elements of the model that kind of spoke to how people chose to vote or chose to participate electorally. And what we're seeing, interestingly, in this election is everyone thought it was going to be one of unprecedented mobilization. People thought it was going to be a kind of, what I term in theory, a paramount situation. You know, one of these moments where people feel, oh, we have to change the government. We're done with the last one. We want a new one. Let's bring in the Labour Party. What we saw, interestingly, was that there was not that upsurge of spontaneous participation. Instead, what we saw was a kind of fairly depressed turnout. And in some of the initial research that we've been doing on the election, what we're seeing is actually that pattern is repeated. So you have these affinities that really are in place, but actually you're not seeing convergence conditions that you would expect with extraordinary turnout. And so in some sense, it's beginning to suggest, and this is all very early days, but it's beginning to suggest that actually the model might be quite helpful in explaining electoral behavior as well. Of course, there's way more research and testing to do, but I'm very excited that this theory that I developed to think about protest is also something that we can expand to other forms of political participation, because that really shows that your research might have some legs.
All eyes will be on what happens across the pond in November with the US presidential election. Populists and establishment forces are set to clash in a Trump and, at the time of recording, Biden rematch. What does this mean for the future of democracy in that country and more widely?
I think we're almost certain to see unprecedented levels of mobilization around the US election, no matter what the results are. Many people in the United States are very afraid of what might happen were Trump to come to power again for a second term. This is particularly notable given that the stakes for both Trump and the American people are much higher. There is now a concerted conflict, essentially, between many arms of the US government and Trump, who might be about to come into power in it. On the other hand, Trump supporters, I think, also feel very passionately about their candidate and will be very disappointed if he doesn't win. And as we saw in the last electoral cycle, there are forms of mobilization that they might wish to undertake. A kind of January 6th scenario is certainly not off the cards, were their candidate not to win. However, it will be harder for them to do this in that particular fashion, as the incumbent controlling the levers of government is, of course, now the Democratic Party. But nonetheless, what we might see as a consequence of that is more kind of spontaneous outbreaks of protest that follow fewer rules than the already quite unruly January 6th insurrection followed.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly going to be an interesting time. I think the best thing that people in the United States can do, at least from a kind of policy-making perspective, is really ensure that people feel included in the democratic process from day one. If you are concerned about the outbreak of electoral violence, for example, in America, it will be because people feel the system is not essentially incorporating their views. And so the best thing that you can do is get people involved in and give them an understanding of the democratic processes they're participating in, help reduce the kind of grievances around the system. However, it may be the case that as the election develops, some protest becomes necessary to secure civil society, depending on what various elected officials or potentially elected officials might choose to do in the electoral context. And I think it's also important that urban administrations, the mayors of cities, as well as the governments of states, are prepared to support protests that are morally justified or necessary for the defense of democracy as well, and to take necessary precautions to ensure that if that were to happen, protesters won't unnecessarily fear for their life or safety when exercising their democratic rights.
Thank you for that, Ben. Yeah, it's definitely watch this space kind of territory. Finally, I know that you've got work in progress with folks in Colombia. What is next for you? Is there anything else on the horizon?
So I've got a few different kind of irons in the fire. Some of these are around the nature of democracy, working with a colleague of mine called Jean-Paul Gagnon and several of his kind of broader network of democratic scholars. We're looking to try and inform the way in which people think about democracy and encourage them to include this kind of civil society component, as well as many other understudied components in their kind of definition or understanding of the term. We're trying to help shift how organizations think about that. We did have some conversations earlier with Facebook around some of these ideas, very early stage things. And we're looking to talk more broadly to companies that support civic discourse and to help them kind of gain a sufficient definition of democracy to help support this kind of civic engagement. One of the other things I'm working on more broadly is trying to understand the nature of resistance movements writ large. We have a really good understanding of how social movements and revolutionary movements work. But these projects of resistance that we've seen as of late and that we see throughout history, often in way more extreme forms, right? Think about resistance during the Soviet Union or indeed during the kind of Nazi occupation of many parts of Europe. Not to mention, of course, resistance also against colonialism. So I'm interested in how these kind of resistance movements function as well. And I'm beginning to try and build the basic building blocks of a theory of resistance movements.
Oh, that is so fascinating, Ben. So thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this chat and to sort of get to know you better and all about your research. From our discussion, there is a lot to consider right at this very moment, and we certainly watch with interest events that are set to unfold over the coming months and years. So wishing you all the very best, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Great. Thank you so much.
You can follow Ben on X, the website formerly known as Twitter, at BDM Abrams to learn more. Some of what we've covered today is also available in the episode notes. If you've enjoyed this episode, we have an archive of 22 past seasons. Search IOE Podcast to find episodes of Research for the Real World, as well as more podcasts from IOE. And a quick favor before you go, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you could give the IOE Podcast a rating. 5 stars would be nice if you're enjoying the show, and that will help us to reach more people who are interested in hearing about such important work. I'm Jason. Thank you for listening.
Research for the Real World is produced by IOE Marketing and Communications and IOE Research Development. The theme music was created by Rob Cochran. Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor, Amy Leibowitz is the series producer, and Jason Ilagan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.